It's time now for us to introduce different visualization methods to visualize temporal data. We have a few ones, but of course we will start with the most common one, the one that you have already seen in the previous videos, which is line charts. So line charts are by far the most common method for visualizing temporal data. They're really powerful. Most people understand very quickly or know exactly how to read them. So it's definitely one of the workhorses of data visualization. So typically in a line chart, what you have is time on the x-axis and some quantity that is measured over time on the y-axis. So the most simple line chart is something with time plus a quantity. Now, there are a number of situations where line charts can be a little bit more complicated than that. So the first one is a situation where you have time plus quantity, but you want to represent at the same time different objects or different categories. So typically this means that you have multiple timelines that you want to show at the same time so that you can compare their trends over time. So here once again I'm using in this graph sales data, and I'm comparing how sales of different types of products compare over time. So we have consumer products, corporate products, and home office products. And as you can see, they tend to have somewhat different volumes and somewhat different trends. So the general case with line charts is that when you have multiple lines, it's very powerful because it's easy to compare their trends and spot where time when these timelines are very similar or very different. So this is very, very powerful. One problem with line charts, though, is that as soon as you go past beyond a handful of lines, and thus objects or categories, it becomes very, very cluttered. So this is an example. Look at the legend that you have on the right. It's not really too many objects, but even with a handful of objects like this one, the visualization can become really, really cluttered and hard to read. So what can you do in this case? I think there are three main classes of solutions. The first one is grouping, the second one is filtering or focusing, and the third one is highlighting. Let me give you an example of these different solutions. So the one that you see on the top left is the original one. So the first solution, possible solution, is grouping. What does grouping mean? Well, if there is a way for you to group these objects into groups or categories, then you can just reduce the number of objects by grouping these objects together. So there are situations where this is possible and it's very powerful, so you reduce the number of timelines that you have to show. The second one is filtering. It's possible that it's not really useful for you or important for you to represent all of these timelines at the same time, but maybe you want to communicate something about a subset of these timelines. Well, then if this is the case, you can just filter out the rest and keep those that really matter. A similar one is highlighting. So it's very similar to filtering. It requires you to decide which timelines are really important to communicate your message, but you can keep all the other ones in the background with using gray shade that doesn't really interfere with the rest. Actually, there is also a solution, an intermediary solution, that you can use these methods. These methods are not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can do some grouping and some filtering, for instance. What do I mean? Well, what I mean is that you can, for instance, say, I want to keep out of all these timelines just a few that are really important, and I'm going to summarize all of the other by taking the average. So it's very important to keep these methods in mind, and also to remember that it's possible to use them in conjunction. You don't have to necessarily use either one or the other. So keep it in mind because it's very it is a very common case when you are trying to visualize temporal data with line charts and you have too many lines. And what people typically do is they just don't care. They visualize hundreds of timelines, and this doesn't work. You have too much clutter. You don't have enough different number of colors to visualize, to color all of the line with a different color. So it just doesn't work. So every time you find yourself in this situation, think about how can I reduce it intelligently using one or a combination of these methods.